I've kept a weather journal for 41 years. Every day. Temperature, wind, the color of the sky at dusk. I write it all down in the same cheap spiral notebooks, and I've got a whole shelf of them going soft at the corners. People in the valley think it's a strange thing for an old man to do. Maybe it is. But I'll tell you something. In all those years, all those pages, there's only one winter I can't bring myself to read back. The winter it all went to hell across the valley. The winter that took nearly everything from a woman I barely knew, her cattle, her savings, the last of her hope. It took the ground out from under her one frozen inch at a time, and I watched it happen from my kitchen window like a coward, telling myself it wasn't my business. And I'll tell you the part nobody believes when I say it out loud. The only reason she's alive today, the only reason, is that a broken-down old draft horse, a horse that should have been too tired and too cold and too smart to bother, refused to leave her out there in the snow. That horse did what I didn't have the courage to do. So before you scroll away, stay with me, because this isn't a story about a horse. Not really. It's a story about what keeps us breathing when the world has given us every good reason to stop. And if you've ever felt like winter took everything from you too, I think you'll understand why I finally had to write this one down. Here's how it started. The pounding woke me at 3:12 in the morning. I know the exact time because the first thing I do, even half asleep, even scared, is look at the clock and reach for the pencil. 41 years. Some habits don't ask permission. At first I thought it was the wind. We'd been 3 days into a storm that the radio called a significant weather event, which is the kind of soft, useless phrase people use when they've never had to dig a frozen cow out of a drift with their bare hands. The wind had been throwing itself against the north wall of the house since Tuesday, and I'd stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. But this was different. This had rhythm, heavy and then heavier and then a long scrape. I got up. My knees told me what they always tell me, and I told them to shut up, and I went to the back door in my socks with a flashlight that was mostly dead. There in a cone of weak yellow light, standing in snow up to his chest, was Solomon. I knew that horse. Everybody in the valley knew Saul. He was a Belgian draft, the color of an old penny, with feet like dinner plates and a white blaze that had gone gray at the edges the way people's hair does. He belonged to Nora Beckett, 3/4 of a mile across the valley floor, and he had no earthly business being at my door in the dark at the worst hour of the worst night of the year. He was blowing hard. Steam rolled off him in sheets. There was ice crusted along his eyelashes and a wound on his shoulder where he'd torn through wire somewhere between her place and mine. I'd find that out later, the fence he'd broken to get to me. His whole body was shaking, not from cold, I think, but from something closer to what I'd call panic if I let myself use that word about an animal. He looked at me, and then he turned his big head back toward the valley, toward Nora's, and he made a sound I have never heard a horse make before or since. Low, almost a groan. I'm an old man. I don't move fast, but I've lived my whole life around animals, and there is a language they speak that has nothing to do with the words we put in their mouths in stories. Saul wasn't lost. He wasn't spooked. He had come 3/4 of a mile through a white-out breaking fence to stand at the one lit window he could see. He'd come to get me. I want to tell you I threw on my coat and went. It wasn't that clean. I stood there in the doorway for maybe 10 full seconds arguing with myself, and I'm not proud of a single one of them. I told myself the phone lines were probably down. They were. I told myself I couldn't drive it in this. I couldn't. I told myself Nora Beckett was a grown woman who'd made it clear enough over the years that she didn't want my help or anybody's, and that whatever was wrong over there wasn't mine to fix. And underneath all of that, the real one, the ugly little truth, I was afraid. 69 years old, alone, and afraid of the cold and the dark and of what I might find. Saul groaned again. I went and got dressed. I put on everything I owned. I found the good flashlight in the barn, the big lantern-style one, and I filled a thermos with the coffee still warm on the stove, and I grabbed the wool blankets off my own bed because some part of my brain had already decided what I was going to need them for. I hitched nothing, saddled nothing. There wasn't time and there wasn't light. I just went out into it on foot, following a horse. You have not been cold until you have been out in a plains blizzard at 3 in the morning. The wind doesn't blow so much as it erases. It takes the world down to about 4 feet in front of your face, and it fills that little space with knives. My eyes froze half shut. My beard turned to a slab. Twice I lost Saul entirely in the white and had to stop, heart slamming, until his big dark shape swam back into view. And every time I stopped, he stopped too and waited. And I swear to you he shortened his stride so an old man could keep up. I have replayed that walk 1,000 times. In the retelling it takes on a kind of grandeur, but the truth is it was mostly just misery and the sound of my own breathing and the certainty, growing with every step, that I was too late. Then Saul stopped, and this time he didn't wait. He dropped his head and pushed forward into a drift that had built up along the south side of Nora's collapsed hay shed. I say collapsed because that's what it was. The whole roof of it caved in under the weight of 3 days of snow. One wall folded over like wet cardboard. And there, in the lee of that ruin, in the little pocket of shelter the wreckage had made, was Nora. She was on her side in the snow. She wasn't moving. Saul had made a wall of himself. That's the thing I need you to understand, the thing that broke something in me right there in the dark. He'd been standing over her, between her and the wind. There was a horse-shaped hollow in the drift where he'd been standing for God knows how long before he gave up on her waking and went for help. The snow was piled against his side of the pocket, and her side, where his body had been blocking it, was almost clear. He hadn't run for warmth. He hadn't gone to the barn where his hay was. He had planted himself over a woman who couldn't move, and he had stood there taking the storm on his own back until his last idea ran out, and then he'd gone to find the one light in the valley. I dropped down beside her. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my glove off to find her pulse. She had one slow, thready, but there. Nora, I patted her cheek, which was cold as clay. Nora, it's Cal Renner, come on now. Her eyes came open a slit. And here's the thing I'll carry to my grave. She looked at me, and she didn't look grateful, and she didn't look afraid. She looked disappointed. You should have let me be, she said. Her voice was a dry scrape. I was almost warm. I need to stop the story here and tell you about Nora Beckett, because if I don't, you'll misunderstand what she meant, and you'll think worse of her than she deserved. Nora and her husband Frank ran cattle in that valley for 30 years. Good stock, good ground, the kind of small operation that never made anybody rich but that let 2 people build a whole life out of hard work in each other. I knew Frank better than I knew her. He was an easy man, quick to laugh, the sort who'd stop his truck on the road just to talk to you about nothing for 20 minutes. Nora was quieter, watchful. She kept the books, and she kept Frank honest, and she didn't waste words on people she hadn't decided to trust yet, and she'd never quite decided about me. Frank died 2 winters before the one I'm telling you about. Heart, in the night in his sleep beside her. 58 years old. One day he was there, and the next she woke up next to a man who'd gone cold sometime around dawn, and she was alone on 400 acres with 140 head of cattle and no children and no notion in the world of how to stop. She didn't stop. That was the thing about Nora. Everybody expected her to sell. A widow can't run that place alone, they said in the diner, in the feed store, in the low voices people use when they've already buried you. She heard them. And out of spite, I honestly believe, out of pure stubborn spite, she stayed. She learned to do everything Frank had done. She fixed her own fence and pulled her own calves and drove to the auction alone and stared down men who tried to lowball a woman. And for a while, for a year or so, it looked like she might just make it out of grief on the back of sheer refusal. Then came this winter. It started killing her cattle in November. An early ice storm caught a bunch of them out on the far pasture, and she lost 11 head in one night. Then the snow came and didn't leave, and the hay she put up, The hay that was supposed to carry the herd to spring started running short because the winter was longer and meaner than anything the almanac had promised. She sold cattle to buy hay to feed the cattle she had left, which is the kind of math that eats a ranch alive from the inside. By January she was down to 40 head. By the night Saul came to my door she was down to 9, and one of those, a heifer she'd been up 3 nights trying to keep alive, had died in her arms that evening in the collapsing shed. She'd carried the dead calf out into the storm. I found that out after. She'd carried it out because she couldn't stand to have it in there with her, and somewhere out in that white nothing she'd gone down in the snow, exhausted, hollowed out, 40 pounds lighter than she'd been in the fall, 3 days without real sleep, and she had simply run out of reasons to get up. That's what she meant. I was almost warm. She wasn't being dramatic. She was being honest. She'd lost her husband and her cattle and her savings and her certainty, one frozen inch at a time, and out there in the drift, with the wind gone soft and dreamy the way it goes right before it kills you, she had finally found the bottom of what a person can carry, and she'd set it down. And a horse would not let her. Saul had nudged her, then pushed her. Then, when she wouldn't rise, he'd stood over her. I know because there were the marks of it, the way she was tucked against the shed wall like something had hurted her there. And when standing over her wasn't enough, when she'd gone still and quiet and started slipping away, that horse had done the only other thing he could think of. He'd left her, which must have gone against every instinct in his big, loyal body, and he'd run for the light. Getting her home is a blur I've never been able to fully assemble. I got the blankets around her. I got some of the coffee into her, a swallow at a time, mostly down her chin. I couldn't carry her. I'm not going to pretend I could. I'm an old man and she was dead weight, and the drifts were chest-high in places. It was Saul who carried her. I got him down. That's the part people don't believe, a draft horse, spooked, hurt, exhausted. And I got him to lie down in the snow by talking to him the way Frank used to, low and steady, calling him big man, easy now, big man, and he folded those great legs and went down. And between the two of us, me pushing and her clawing with the last of what she had, we got Nora up over his back. And then he stood, careful as anything I've ever seen, careful like he knew, and he carried her the whole 3/4 of a mile home while I walked at his head with a fistful of his mane, both of us leaning into the dark. Halfway across the valley, the wind quit for about 30 seconds. Just stopped, the way it sometimes does, a hole in the storm. And in that sudden silence I could hear Nora, up on the horse's back, crying. Not loud. Just a thin, broken sound, the sound a person makes when they've been holding something in for 2 winters and it finally slips. Frank, she was saying, over and over, Frank, Frank. She thought the horse was carrying her to her husband. I didn't correct her. Some kindnesses are just keeping your mouth shut. Then the wind came back and swallowed the whole world again, and we walked on. By the time I got her into my kitchen and out of the frozen clothes and wrapped and warming by the stove, it was near 5 in the morning. Her core temperature was low enough that I was genuinely afraid. I'd seen enough hypothermia in animals to know the danger isn't always the cold itself, but what the reheating does to a heart that's been slowed nearly to stopping. I didn't have a way to call anyone. The lines were down, the roads were gone, and my old truck wouldn't have made it to the end of the drive. So I did the only thing there was to do. I sat with her. I kept her warm. I talked to her, mostly nonsense, the weather journal, the temperatures, 41 years of numbers, because it was the only thing in my head steady enough to say out loud. And every little while I'd get up and go to the window and look out at the barn, where I'd put Saul, and where he stood in the dark with his torn shoulder and his frozen lashes and his whole body finally allowed to shake. Somewhere around 6, as the black outside started going the bruised gray of a winter dawn, Nora's eyes opened. Clear this time, her. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the stove. She looked at me sitting in the chair I'd pulled up beside her, and I watched her put it together. Watched her remember. Watched the whole terrible arithmetic of the night rearrange itself behind her eyes. The horse, she said. It was the first thing she asked. Not where am I, not what happened, the horse. He's in my barn, I said. He's all right, tore his shoulder up some, he's all right. She closed her eyes again, and 2 tears ran down sideways into her gray hair, and she said, so quiet I almost missed it. He wouldn't let me go. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not a man who's good with the big moments. I never was. So I did what I always do. I picked up my pencil and I turned to the day's page in the notebook, and under the wind speed and the temperature and the color of the sky, I wrote 4 words I've never written before or since. Saul brought her home. And I thought that was the end of it. I thought the story was that a horse saved a woman's life on the coldest night of the year. I had no idea. The winter wasn't done with either of them yet. And the hardest thing Nora Beckett would have to survive that year wasn't the cold at all. It was the choice that came after. The storm broke 2 days later. The plows came through on the 4th day, and the phone lines came back on the 5th. And by the end of that first week, the valley had that strange, stunned brightness. A place gets after real weather, everything glittering and buried and quiet, the damage hidden under a foot of clean snow that made the whole ruined world look like a Christmas card. You could almost forget, looking at it, that anything had died out there. Nora stayed with me those first few days. Not because she wanted to, she'd have crawled home on the first morning if I'd let her, but because she physically couldn't, and because a doctor I finally reached by phone told me in no uncertain terms that a woman who'd been that hypothermic and that malnourished needed watching. So she stayed in my spare room, and she ate the food I put in front of her the way a person eats who's forgotten they're allowed to, and mostly she stared out the window at the barn where her horse was. We didn't talk much. That was fine by both of us. But I learned things in those quiet days, in the way you learn things about a person when you're just sharing space with them, and the pretense has been knocked out of you both. I learned she was broke, not struggling, broke all the way down past the bottom. The cattle were gone. The 9 she'd had left were down to 6 now, and 6 head can't service a debt built for 140. She'd mortgaged the ground the first winter after Frank died when she was too proud to sell and too green to run the numbers right, and now the bank was circling the way banks do, patient and polite and absolutely without mercy. She was going to lose the place. She knew it. She'd known it, I think, out there in the snow. That was part of what she'd set down when she lay down to die. The farm was already gone. She'd just been the last one to admit it. And I learned about Saul. He'd been Frank's horse. Frank had bought him as a green 3-year-old and broke him to harness himself, and for 15 years that horse and that man had worked ground together, and when Frank died, Saul was the one thing Nora couldn't bring herself to sell no matter how bad it got. Not for sentiment, she told me. She said the word sentiment like it tasted bad, but because he still worked. He earned his hay. He pulled the sled to feed cattle in the deep snow when no truck could get through. He dragged deadstock out of pastures. He did, that whole brutal winter, the work of a machine she couldn't afford to fuel. He was the last working animal on a dying ranch, and she'd kept him because he was useful. That's what she said, because he's useful. She said it looking out the window at him with an expression on her face that had nothing whatsoever to do with usefulness. And I had the sense, not for the first time, of being in the presence of a person who'd learned to only love things out loud if she could find a practical reason to. The vet came out on the 2nd week, once the roads allowed it. His name was Del Cranmer, and he'd been the large animal man in that county for 30 years, and he did not, as a rule, waste words. He looked at Saul's shoulder, which was healing. He looked at Saul's feet and his teeth and his eyes. And then he stood there in my barn for a long time with his hand flat on the horse's chest, listening to something with his face gone still, and when he took the stethoscope out of his ears, he didn't look at me. He looked at Nora. His heart's not right, Del said. The cold that went through the barn then had nothing to do with the weather. He explained it plain. Something had happened out there in the storm, the strain of it, the cold, carrying a grown woman 3/4 of a mile through chest-deep snow after standing sentry for hours in a killing wind. A younger horse might have shrugged it off. But Saul was 18, which is old for a draft, and the effort had done something to him, torn something loose in the great engine of him, and now his heart skipped and stumbled in a way Dell didn't like at all. He might have years, Dell said. Easy pasture, no work, no stress. He might go on a good long while, or he might drop dead in the next month. There's no way for me to tell you which. Nora's voice, when it came, was flat as slate. And working him. Dell shook his head. You work that horse hard again, you'll kill him. Might be next week, might be one hard pull, but you'll kill him. And there it was. The thing the winter had been sharpening the whole time, waiting to hand her. Because Nora Beckett did not have the money to keep a horse that couldn't work. She barely had the money to keep herself. She was about to lose the ground he'd graze on. And the plain, ugly, mathematical truth of her situation, the truth she'd have laid out for anybody else without flinching, was that a broke woman losing her farm cannot afford to feed an 18-year-old draft horse with a bad heart out of nothing but love. The practical thing, the thing everyone in that valley would have understood, would have nodded at, would have called sense, was to put him down, or sell him for meat, which was the same thing dressed uglier, but which would at least put a few $100s against a debt that was going to bury her regardless. A working animal that can't work is a bill you can't pay. Frank himself, God rest him, had put down horses over the years for less. It was ranch life. It was the arithmetic of a hard country. Dell packed up his bag. At the barn door he stopped and said the thing vets say, the mercy of it. You want, I can do it now. Save him the winter, save you the feed. He wouldn't feel a thing. I watched Nora's face. I've thought about it every day since. Here was a woman who had lost her husband, her herd, her savings, her home, and very nearly her own life. A woman who had learned the hard and repeated way that the world takes and does not ask permission, and that survival means letting go of things before they can be torn out of your hands. Everything in her hard-won philosophy pointed one direction. Everything sensible. Everything she'd taught herself to be since the morning she woke up next to a cold man and decided not to die of it. And she looked at the horse that had refused to apply that same cold arithmetic to her, out there in the snow, when leaving her would have been the sensible thing, when standing sentry cost him the very heart that was now failing him. Saul had done the math on Nora's life and come up with an answer that made no practical sense at all, and he'd nearly killed himself proving it. No, Nora said. Dell waited. No, she said again, and her voice broke on it, and she didn't try to fix it. He didn't do the sensible thing with me. I'm not going to do it with him. I'd like to tell you it worked out clean. It didn't. Nothing about that winter worked out clean. She lost the farm. There was never any real chance she wouldn't. The mortgage was underwater from the start, and the winter had only hurried what was already coming. The bank took the 400 acres, and the house Frank had built, and the barns and the ground where 30 years of their life was buried, and it sold at auction in the spring to a big outfit 2 counties over that ran the fences down and folded it into somebody's balance sheet. Nora watched it go. I stood next to her at the auction, and neither of us said a word. But here's what she kept. She kept Saul. That was the whole fight, not the land in the end, but the horse, and she won it the only way it could be won, which was by giving up everything else. I helped her. I won't pretend I didn't, and I won't make a big thing of it either, because it wasn't much and it cost me little. I had ground he could graze. I had a barn with an empty stall. I'd been alone on my place for 11 years since my own wife passed, and I'd told myself I liked it that way. And it turned out I was lying, and it took a broke widow and a broken horse to show me. They came to live at the edge of my land. Nora rented the old hired hand's cottage that had stood empty since before I bought the place, fixed it up herself, took work in town at the feed store where the same people who'd whispered about her had to buy their supplies from her now, which I think she enjoyed more than she'd ever admit. And Saul lived out his days in my back pasture with nothing asked of him at all. He lived 3 more years. Dell was wrong, or the pasture was right, or the horse was just too stubborn to die on schedule. I don't know which. 3 good years of standing in the sun and eating grass and doing not one useful thing and being loved out loud, finally, by a woman who'd stopped needing an excuse. She was with him at the end. It was spring, and it was quiet, and he went down in the pasture in the afternoon, and she sat in the grass with his big head in her lap for the better part of an hour while it happened, and I stayed up at the house and let them be. When it was over, she came up to the porch and sat next to me, and we watched the light go down over the valley, over the ground that used to be hers. "You know what he was," she said after a long while. I didn't. I said so. "He was Frank's last word," she said. "Frank never got to say goodbye, when in his sleep, but he left me that horse, and that horse wouldn't let me follow him into the snow." She wasn't crying. She was past that, into the calm country on the other side of it. "So I figure Frank said it after all. Just took him 15 years and one bad winter to get it out. I've got that weather journal still, 44 years now. I went back not long ago and found the page. The coldest night, 3 days into a significant weather event, whined out of the northwest at speeds I recorded, because recording is the only thing I know how to do with a thing too big to hold. And underneath the numbers, in my own bad handwriting, the 4 words I wrote at 6 in the morning, while a woman wept 2 tears sideways into her gray hair. Saul brought her home. I've thought a lot in the years since about what saves us. We tell ourselves it's the big things: love, faith, the will to live. Maybe. But I was there, and I'll tell you what I saw. What saved Nora Beckett wasn't her own will to live, because she'd set that down in the snow. What saved her was something outside her that refused to accept the sensible math of her death. A dumb, loyal, penny-colored animal who should have gone to the barn for his hay and instead stood over a dying woman taking the storm on his back. And then, when that wasn't enough, ran 3/4 of a mile through a whiteout on the strength of one small idea. "There's a light over there. Someone will come." I was the light. I almost didn't come. I think about that most of all. Not the horse's courage. The horse's courage is the easy part of the story, the part that plays well. I think about the 10 seconds I stood in my own doorway arguing with myself while a woman froze across the valley, and how close I came to closing that door, and how the whole rest of both our lives turned on a hinge that nearly swung the other way. She lived 11 more years after Saul. Died in that little cottage at the edge of my land in her sleep, the way Frank did, which she'd have called fitting and which I called merciful. We were friends by then. More than friends, I suppose, though we were too old and too private to ever put a name to it, and it doesn't need one now. I still keep the journal, every day. Temperature, wind, the color of the sky at dusk. And every year, when the first real cold comes down out of the north and the sky goes that particular flat gray that means the winter's finally serious, I go out to the back pasture where a penny-colored horse is buried under a flat stone with no name on it, because Nora said he never needed his name written down to know who he was.